The first thing is, what is this liminal word? Liminal in Cynefin refers to in between, well, liminal everywhere refers to an in between or a threshold state, that space that's in between two other spaces. And particularly a sense of moving from one thing to another in a state of tension that you get in transitions, where things are not A or B, and in fact, they're both A and B at the same time, maybe, and the world makes you feel like we wanted to make it either A or B, but we're stuck in the middle. So in Cynefin, those spaces are represented by these green swooshes that run through the framework. And what that is particularly showing is where we're opening up the thresholds between domains. So what I want you to notice is where there is not a green line. So between complicated and clear, there is no phase shift. This is actually, but arguably you could gray out this boundary, because the move from complicated to clear is often about how many different moving parts there are and how technical they are. There's not, I know many of you found it challenging on the blue line to agree on exactly where we draw that line literally. What is liminal is the space between complex and complicated, because quite often we're working in the space between them, or things are moving through that space between them. That's a particularly catalytic and important time to be paying attention. The same applies to the space here that we see quite a broad space defined in chaotic and complex. What you will notice, a couple of little quirks in how this is drawn. The space in chaotic is closed, right? The green can't seep out. And that's because you always want to constrain that, because chaos is not our friend. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Where here, it's a much more open boundary. So things can go to all sorts of interesting places from that liminal space between complex and complicated. So liminality is also about avoiding premature convergence. Often in a process when it feels like we're moving from complex, throwing ideas around, to some kind of convergence, we have an instinct to jump on it and push it over the line. But in fact, we're saying this is a space where we should slow down. Making that transition too early or prematurely is in fact quite risky. And we're going to play out some scenarios and examples of why. Dan, will you monitor the chat and just let me know if I need to pause?
Yep, we're good.
Great. So the first dynamic that we're going to have a look at today, and before I even talk about these, I do want to say the disclaimers here are, what we're going to talk about today is some of the most abstracted archetypal patterns that you could imagine. There are literally an infinite number of patterns of how things can and do transition and move through Cynefin. But these are some of the classic ones. And I think particularly interestingly, there's some of the patterns that systems and organizations tend to try and exploit. So the blue line is the explore-exploit dynamic, as we call it. And this is a classic one where it's one of the most stable patterns, and it's one that organizational systems and practices are often trying to intentionally work, which is moving from the complex into the more ordered domains, where at least the initial movement is from complex into complicated. So when you make the transition successfully, that can be a really good movement, because things become more predictable, more ordered, more replicable, more repeatable. And you get linear causality, you can scale, you get all sorts of things that certainly the capitalist system tells us are good. However, these little points on the graph, the alpha, beta, and gamma, there's a little key on the left if you're not so up to speed on your Greek like me, they are points where we have to pay particular attention. So when something is moving from the complex domain into the liminal space, at this alpha point here, it has effectively exited complex, but it's in a special zone of complicated. We could say almost the newly hatched complicated, where what we're doing there is a testing process. So the alpha inflection space is very much in the liminal zone, and we have a bit of a decision point there. And we have to ask ourselves, is this genuinely stable enough? Is there enough repeatability? Can we understand cause and effect? Can the experts provide good practices that are sufficient in order for this to continue moving into complicated? So if it is sufficiently stable, then as the certainty increases, it goes into the complicated domain. And at a certain point, we can ask again, do we now understand this even better to the point where we could standardize it? And at that point, it could potentially move towards clear. Now, down at the bottom here is a delta point where before we go to clear, we do one last check, because the movement into clear is often somewhat irreversible. This is where we build the thing into our software systems. We build it into everything as assumptions. about how things work around here and how they will always continue to work in perpetuity. So those changes are often quite slow, expensive, and difficult to roll back. So we have to have that point. Now, the alternative is we get to our beta point here and we do not feel sufficiently confident to move into clear. In fact, we find that there's something a little bit more to learn here. So for as long as the probes kind of are not producing reputable results, or we find out that actually people have maybe been gaming the system to some extent, we need to move back into complex to explore and understand it further. And this particular point in the middle, this gamma point, is taking us into what we call the aporetic domain. So the middle domain of Cynefin has got a gray area and a green area. The gray area is just confused. We don't know what the domains are. We don't know where we are. We don't know what's going on. The green area, being aporetic, is like intentional confusion. And so this is where in the kind of change or innovation language we talk about relaxing the constraints, opening up possibilities, exploring new possibilities, and exploring new questions. Now, if we get to that delta point and we realize it's not actually as clear as we thought it was, we can't build it into our software system, etc., that can be disruptive. And so from that delta point, what we sometimes have is the root of kind of radical change, which is the shallow dive into chaos. And so there, the material kind of bounces off this boundary between complicated and clear because it fails this test. And we move through some structured confusion or aporia. We take a shallow dive into chaos where we kind of let all the rules go up in the air and we really destabilize some of our assumptions and constraints in order to see what new and novel thinking might emerge, which inevitably tends to take us up into the complex again. Okay, so this is typically a last-ditch recovery from the delta point. If we thought we were in clear and we end up in chaotic, that's typically not a good week for the system, but it is a point where radical new thinking is required. And often there, for instance, we use some quite disruptive techniques like innovation, bringing in different perspectives, etc. David.
Super interesting. And what happens if there was a decision at the gamma point to shift it to clear, but it was the wrong decision? So political reasons or whatever, the organization, that's exactly the situation I'm consulting in right now. Yeah. So this assurance company moved to a new software system and the project to move to this new system was too big to fail. So it needed to happen. And I'm interviewing people right now and I'm working hypothesis based. So I try to work against this pattern entrainment and stuff like that, but another story. But so what they are telling me is the shift was not the right decision. Yeah. But they cannot go back. So my question is, what happens now? Do they need to fall to chaotic or is there any other way to go back?
Well, the way to contain it is to make that dive more shallow and more aporetic. And so part of what aporia says is we have to suspend the assumption that we can't go back now, for instance, and maybe we can't go back because this is where we are. So sorry, let me kind of get my thoughts in order there. You can never delete the attempted change from the organizational memory. So in that case, you can't go back. But what they do need to be able to do is to say, we're no longer attached to the new solution. Again, all bets are off. All solutions are open now. If they persist in moving things into the clear and rigid domain, what typically ends up happening is what we call the falling off the cliff into chaos. So you would end up deeper in chaos, in a more chaotic state of chaos. Often what I also observe is if we're insisting on holding on to that story, people in the organization are going to just keep us there longer by, for instance, pretending that they're following the standard procedure when actually they're not. So these are often just a more disruptive move. And what we're trying to do here with this inflection point is to make that more shallow, make that less disruptive. The deeper you go, the more disruptive it is. Now, true chaos in a business organization is relatively rare. It usually requires full blackouts or complete PR disasters. So most of the time, although it might feel really chaotic to people, it is a shallow dive, even in that scenario.
Okay, but it's something I need to address with leadership.
Yeah, and the risk of pushing into the clear domain when it's not appropriate is always that we are dancing on the cliff to chaos, and that's what this wiggly line at the bottom means. Dan, anything to add there?
Yeah, another really cool phrase I picked up from Dave was listen to your cynics. right? So listen to the cynics, the people in your organization that still care enough to say something, right? They're a bit cynical though, but they usually have some intuition or some ideas about why this is going to be not work out. And in horrible examples from my Intel day, what this would sometimes look like is you have a junior process engineer that says that they know the right thing, they're the expert, they're the person with the college degree, and they tell the technicians who've been here for 15 or 20 years, this is the right thing to do, this is the right way to maintain the equipment or run this process. And the senior technician says, I Captain, I'm going to blindly follow what you're saying. We are going to scrap a whole bunch of product, and I will do that just to prove how stupid your idea is. And that's a little bit, and we call that malicious compliance, like maliciously comply with your order to, burn several $1 million worth of product. So yeah, you really want to avoid that in your culture if you can.
And I think a rule of thumb for me would be when you're working there, as we move around from chaotic to complex to complicated to clear in that kind of clockwise direction, typically we are reducing granularity. In other words, we're rolling things up into bigger and bigger chunks. So in the complicated, the experts have reduced it to 5 options. In complex, it's an infinite number, and in clear, it's 1, right? One of the ways to help soften this and reduce the cliff is to increase granularity. So to say, we've got this big solution we've rolled out, it's probably not all garbage because there's some smart people here. So let's break it down into its component parts. And part of this process could be looking at what is working, what does make sense. It is difficult to avoid blame games and mudslinging in that conversation, but typically the most useful kind of cognitive move to make is reduce granularity, which makes it easier to see that some things maybe do belong in clear even. Maybe that was the right move for aspects of that solution, but some parts maybe we need to look at again. Okay, so then the next dynamic I always enjoy talking about, because I talk about this as the Donna Dynamic. So in some wonderful parts of the world, we live in this grazing dynamic where you're continuously scanning, incubating, and exploring, sometimes referred in the kind of development world as perpetual beta. So this is often observed in fluid situations or situations in which people, for whatever reason, are often working at the edge of current practice and understanding, and therefore they are fluid. They're emerging and evolving pretty quickly. In this, we start in the complex domain with exploration and multiple safe-to-fail probes, which is pretty much always what we're doing in the complex domain. But at the alpha decision point here, which is the same alpha decision point in our blue dynamic, as you'll see in the next slide, we realize that it's actually clear that the patterns that are emerging are only ever temporary. And while there is some logic and pattern in whatever we're doing, it is not in fact ready to be shifted across into the realm of the experts. And so instead, we never really settle out of the liminal area. And you see this green space is almost providing a channel for this particular dynamic. So we pass through aporia, where again, we decompose, we recompose, we exact, we look at what do we have, what could we use that for, how could we play with matching needs and assets in a different way, with a shallow dive into chaos to disrupt some patterns, to disrupt assumptions, to open up a space for some real novelty to emerge. And we keep going round and round that cycle, and we might discover more and more repeatable patterns. And eventually we might join the blue line. So what I always say, and see how the blue and purple dynamics intersect here, what I always say is that early startups and people focused on innovation tend to be working in the purple dynamic, but if they're going to succeed and scale, they have to find a way to mesh the purple dynamic and the blue dynamic. That at the alpha point here, what we're often trying to do is see what is repeatable enough that we can take it out into the scaling dynamic of blue. Because even if the blue dynamic doesn't make it into obvious or clear, there's still a lot of efficiency and utility in just running the blue dynamic with your product or your business. I say Dave operates in the purple loop. As soon as something starts becoming clear, Dave's pretty much done with it and on to the next iteration of exploring whatever is unclear. And part of where Dave and I try to interface is catching the stable aspects and building them into training like this so that we can scale them and share them with the world. And part of the challenge in that in practicality is that the cycles and the cadences of these different dynamics can be quite different. So in your organizations, you've probably got a couple of examples of one part that is trying to operate like a purple dynamic, another part that's far more blue dynamic or traditional sort of analytical world, And when they try to sync with each other, which is essential, they grind their gears. So it's almost literally like two cogs that spin at different speeds. David.
So you talk a lot about scaling, but isn't it also possible to scale in the complex domain? That would be so that would be the first question.
Yes, and you don't get quite the same efficiencies of scale as you do here. And so realistically, scaling in the complex domain is often somewhat limited in terms of certainly the strategies you can use to do so and the energy required to do it, perhaps. So we can't standardize, might be a better clear word for what happens when we move across that boundary, but we can to some extent scale. There are very few complex organizations with more than 100 staff, as for instance, organizations that operate on some kind of a complex model rather than your traditional hierarchical management, no matter how .com and agile it might be, if we've still got team leads and team managers and that kind of thing. So Dan, anything to add on that maybe in terms of scaling?
Scaling in complex is quite different, I think, than scaling on the ordered side. So we could go back to that metaphor, or that example of Napoleon marched to the sound of the guns, right? So that was a way to scale, to get multiple troops heading in the right direction at the same time with a very loose kind of command to head to where you're hearing the guns fire, right? So that's a sense of scaling in a complex domain.
And I think you also call out a good point in that it's maybe stabilizing as we move across rather than scaling. And that can sometimes enable people to operate more independently. So realistically, if Dave is reinventing the method every time he's using it, which is current status for things like Estrin mapping that are very much cutting edge for him, we can't teach it to you and send you off to do it in clients very practically. So it's that kind of beyond just scaling, I think it's the ability for the thing, whatever it is, to begin to exist on its own and independently versus to be in what often feels like quite a churn and like nothing is ever certain. I'll also tell you that for different personality types, these different dynamics feel very different. Some people find the purple dynamic exhausting and some people thrive on it. So it's different for different things. And it's not that one is better than the other, but of course, if we're working with really complex problems, we want to beware the temptation to push. And I think in Western society, particularly, and sort of modern capitalist society, there's an inherent thing that says, well, if some is good, then more must be better. We should always scale it. You should grow your business if you can. We should always push things to be more standardized, more simplified. And part of the message is that's not always a good idea. And if you try to force it, you're surfing chaos in this red dynamic. So again, there can be an infinite number of dynamics. These are overly simplistic, and we're going to invite you to actually think about some of your own dynamics. These are really the archetypal 3 out of an infinite number.
May I add one more?
Yeah, of course.
So, and how do you sync these different cadences, I think you speak about? So you have a very different dynamic in the purple dynamic than the blue line. So how do you go about these differences and how do you bring them together, that they work together?
So one of the first principles, I think, is that you have to slow down at each of these inflection points, and everybody needs to agree sufficiently to slow down enough to have a conversation. And those questions that we rattled off about those points is part of how you sync, as you work through those and you check. The practical answer, bearing in mind in Basecamp, we're trying to give answers general enough to apply to the Navy and agile software development and leadership coaching. So the practical answers are always highly abstracted and tend to be contextual. In organizations, there are often things to do with literal cadences. So if you have one group that's operating on a very innovative agile schedule and another group that's more waterfall, how often and at what points do we bring them together and have them try to sync their view of the world? That often is about bringing people together and having them spend the time to check in on those questions and check their assumptions and sync their views of the world. Here in particular, we have a couple of weak signal detectors in our world, which you can often build into these places. A clear signal that something is ready to perhaps be codified, which is what we call it in the sort of training learning world. is that Dave has taught it X number of times and he's starting to get bored with it. So that's slightly humorous, but more to the point that a number of clients have started to understand how they would use it and what its utility is. So the market sort of says to us, we think we're ready to take this out of the purple dynamic into the blue. In the purple dynamic, you're often working with your early adopters, your alpha beta testers, your kind of people who are willing to work with an imperfect, unfinished idea or product. Mm-hmm. So those are some more examples of how that can play out. But again, please rest assured, we're going to spend not only some more time today, but also time next week, Wednesday or Tuesday, whenever our first class next week is, getting into this in a lot more detail with real examples from your context. And that's when it comes to life, I think.
I think we have some time, Donna, but another example from my Intel days, this is in the nature of process technology for semiconductors. We had an R&D organization of about 5,000 engineers. These are your PhD scientists, often with 10, 20 years experience developing new physics, new chemistries for new products. And they would operate in this purple domain. They might work on a new process technology for 5 or 10 years. And as soon as it was even halfway close to being ready for production, it would get handed off to another organization called the development organization that was running this blue loop.
Yeah.
And then they would take that half-baked idea, standardize it, lock it down, get it ready to go for high volume manufacturing. And then we would transition to 40,000 engineers that were operating in the obvious domain. Mm-hmm. And this whole kind of orchestration would operate on a 2-year cadence. So whatever new ideas that were coming out of the R&D pipeline that were halfway ready would get handed off to the development organization every 2 years. The development organization would work on it for 2 years and then hand it off to high volume manufacturing. And that whole thing would just run on a 2-year cadence. I mean, different technologies have their different, clock speeds and life cycles and things like that. That just happen to be appropriate for us at Intel for semiconductor processing.
Dan, you've just sparked one there for me that I'd like to share, which is our Cynefin Hexi kits. Some of you may be familiar with them. So Dave's come up with this great idea that he wants to create these physical facilitation tools, these Hexi kits. The first round of those, we were printing them out and cutting them out with scissors and guillotines and rolling them into workshops, very much in this purple skunk works prototyping kind of domain, because they changed every 5 minutes. Then we got to the point of saying, great, we've now iterated a couple of times without any changes. They're working great. Nobody's saying something's missing anymore. We've had 5 successful runs. Now let's actually get them off to the graphic designers and the printers, and we created the proper versions, right? And those, in fact, are going into a quick second round of iteration, because we sent those out into the world in the complicated space, but in the hands of experts. And we said, carry them around, work with them, and tell us what happens. And one of the pieces of feedback is these are a real pain to pack in your briefcase. We need to fix the packaging. It's a lot of air. So we're iterating on that one little piece of it, where what we've been doing up until now is our own team have been receiving from printers, packing, sorting, shipping. Where we want to get as a business is that we are not in the business of logistics and fulfillment around the world. We want that to be outsourced. But only once the packs are more stable is it safe for us to move to what for us would be the final step into obvious, which is to say, these things are sufficiently stable for a year that we can really place some bulk orders. We can outsource fulfillment to a third party who makes the business out of this, and we can just leave them be. Because to take that strategy of outsourcing and standardizing, if we're going to keep making changes, we will burn money. We will constantly literally be setting fire to outdated, obsolete packs of hexes before they've been shipped out. So that's kind of, these are typical kind of product evolution examples. In organizational change processes, the same happens. Often we say, okay, well, we don't know how this work from home thing's going to work. Everybody experiment for a while. And then all the teams experiment and they come up with 17 different solutions. And some of those solutions survived the first month and a lot of them died. And most organizations could then say, oh, well, most teams are working with some combination of these, say, 3 to 5 things. And maybe they got different solutions for a virtual chat platform, but everybody's using one of those. And then we start to experiment with saying, okay, so let's narrow those options. Let's say thou shalt or we recommend, and then let's see how that works. And now some organizations are getting to a place where they're able to have a lot more structure and standardization built into their ways of working virtually. But again, all that needs to happen there is somebody pushes it a little bit too soon and acts like everything is always the same for everybody, and they'll go into a shallow dive into chaos. So I don't think we're done with that cycle of figuring it out yet, but I think a lot of organizations are moving these new ways of working into the complicated domain. We then have clients I'll give you an example. In fact, I work with one of the ministries for the government in New Zealand, and they've decided that this traveling around to trainings is ridiculous for various reasons, to do with climate change, to do with COVID, to do with the proof that we don't have to do that in order to be effective. And so now they've put a hard limit down. Nobody travels anywhere for any training. And so we can't get people to drive 30 minutes from one town to another in order to consolidate their training and make it more efficient and have it cost them less money. So they've probably taken this new virtual way of working a little bit to the extreme, and they're busy experiencing a shallow dive into chaos because they can't make this project budget work. Okay. So we can kind of check out a lot of those examples, particularly of how we get it wrong. When we get it right, it's a lot harder to see because it's subtle, it's nuanced. And hopefully it gets to a point where it's an organic part of how your organization operates. Eric.
So thinking of the hexes and what we've practiced and these two models, on a large software upgrade. So I'm a change manager on a project, which is an SAP upgrade, but they decided at the same time, they're going to standardize across their 25 organizations, right? All the accounting processes, practices, and everything. Because I'm on purpose exaggerating, but in their minds of the senior executive, it's simple. It's accounting. It's clear. Everyone does everything the same. In reality, it's not. Parts of it are, parts of it aren't. So I'm just thinking this is something that, in an ideal situation before the project gets started, where you would take those elements and, like you said, break it down into the components and then go through with them so they understand which parts are maybe they are clear, they are standard rules, if it's, the laws and whatnot, which parts are maybe complicated and which are complex. And then help them navigate this whole approach to standardizing everyone and rolling out this project, but through those various breakdowns of the components.
Yeah. And I would say something I could offer there is think about what kind of data gathering you might be doing so that when you get to these decision points, you've got data from the actual users. So the software system is a great example. We would often run a sense maker where we say to everybody, cool, so the new system's here. We know we're going to have some learnings as we go. Please capture your experiences every time you interact with the system. And so then later when we're sitting in a meeting with IT leaders who are assuring us that the system is perfect and without flaws, we can say, well, let's have a look at these stories. And I'm going to share a little Dave story that he always uses, which is not about computer systems, but it is the military, where we did this with, I think they were in Afghanistan or some similar kind of out of country military place. And everybody thought things were going great, and they thought their new standardized procurement systems were working brilliantly. But what was actually happening is basic things like no latrines arriving at these camps. And so one of the stories was, why do we have to insert 4-letter word here in the trees, under the trees? And it was a real wake-up call to the command there that what they thought the reality on the ground was not. So that's where the storytelling and bringing in the voices from whatever that kind of cutting edge coalface as such is can help in these decision points. Is you're sitting in a situation where 10 people are in a room assuring you that it's all fine, where the rest of the organization maybe has a different perspective, and you may need to find a way to bring in those broader perspectives as a default in complexity. Get more voices, get different voices, ask a 5-year-old, ask a ballerina, just get some more ideas into the system to shake things up. KB?
Yeah, I think you kind of started answering the question a bit for me. I was trying to understand is in your example of where no travel in the New Zealand government, and how does the leadership know that they are going into chaos? Like, obviously, you gave an example of the military. I think I've heard Dave mention that in some of his podcast talks. But besides it being in a very public place, which that's what happened, I think, for that particular example, how do leadership build feedback mechanisms in place that will help assess if something is working or not working? I'm just curious. I mean, you can obviously we can do it after, but that's a piece that's important, right? I mean, when you put something in place, hey, when is this going? When is the transition happening? Is obvious still obvious or not? right?
So particularly with any complex issue or scenario or context, you need to have as much as possible real-time feedback that is disintermediated. In other words, is not filtered, not coming to you through your managers or your consultants, because they will tell you what you want to hear sometimes. So one of the heuristics in any kind of complex or emergent situation is try to increase the amount and diversity of feedback and remove the filters or mediators of that feedback. Absolutely. That often then leads you to be able to talk to leadership about weak signal detection, which is where can we see some of the little inklings and the little weak signals coming in this feedback that maybe the cracks are showing, maybe there's weakness here. The other really straightforward thing is, in a lot of our clients, obviously have been working with these kinds of ways of thinking and methods for a long time, we can just straight out ask people. In some of our clients, if you invite people to shred an idea, it's a piece of jargon we use, you'll be surprised at how enthusiastic they can be. So sometimes just actually making the exact invitation to be capture whenever you are frustrated when it doesn't work. So signals that we might be veering into chaos are often, practically speaking, here, one thing you should look out for is an excessive number of workarounds and people hacking the system, because whatever you've given them to do the job isn't sufficient. So the classic example here is the software system where we're filling it out on SAP, but actually Bob goes home and spends 3 hours every Saturday with his Excel spreadsheets that he's been using for 15 years because Bob doesn't trust the new system. So they're doing the old way and the new way, or they're hacking the system of the new way. The second is increasing frustration from people being expressed, I think, when people keep telling you that it doesn't work the way you think it does. And yeah, Dan, anything to add on that, the sort of early signs that you might be in that space?
Yeah,
Actually, Dan, can you, just before you, I was wondering if you can intel, I'm assuming we talk, I'm more interested in trying to figure out how to assess weak signal detection in a large organization, multiple layers, right? I mean, I think Intel is a pretty big organization, and the DoD I'm working. I'd be interested if you can give me some examples on that.
Yeah, I think another one that Dave picks up on and for weak signal detection is, how many times does your staff need to break the rules to get their job done? How many times do you have to violate a process to do the right thing for a client or a customer? Or how many times do you have to sweep things under the rug and not let upper management know about it because it's the right thing to do for your staff? So what does that rate look like? And oh, you don't know what that rate is? Maybe we should go figure that out, right? And how do you have a pulse on that as a weak signal? And if you don't have a pulse on it, then you could be operating right on the edge of that cliff and about ready to fall off into chaos, and you don't know. So a near-term example that comes up for me is the Southwest Airlines. I don't know if anyone got caught up in that fiasco with their flight scheduling systems. It was a big deal here in the States around New Year's. I think at one point Southwest, it's a pretty major airline. I think it's like a top 2 or 3 in the States. And they had to cancel somewhere in the order of like 80 or 90% of their flights for a couple of days. So imagine a major airline canceling 80 or 90% of their flights. And it's because their IT system for how, like, I think pilots and ground staff actually had to pick up a phone, a physical phone, call on like an 800 number, get placed on hold to figure out whether they should come in and fly a plane or where do they need to be next. And so you had these pilots and these flight crews on hold for hours and hours. And if you're on hold for 6 hours waiting for direction, and you're only allowed by law to work a 12-hour shift, you could be on hold before you time out on your shift. So at any rate, the whole airline fell into catastrophic chaos. But everybody knew this IT system for rescheduling the flight crews was horribly broken for years.
And I want to say my note in the chat, I guess, practically speaking, our default is you've got to build the human sensor network. You've got to enable that sensor network with some way of giving feedback. We like SenseMaker. That's not the only way. And then you need to have a conversation with leadership about how we interpret those patterns. And that's a lot of next week in terms of talking a little bit about the vector theory of change and about how we talk about safe to fail probes and all those other sexy things about how we move forward in complex ways. What I did want to highlight around that, I think particularly, is this idea that we're not necessarily trying to set that up when we need it, right? If you come along in a crisis and you try and now set up a human sensor network and build trust and rhythms into that network, et cetera, it generally doesn't work. So Dave really advocates for building these human sensor networks in times of ordinary need every day, so that you can activate them in times of extraordinary. So examples of human sensor networks is in Wales, in the valleys, where they've got a lot of social and community challenges. They got a bunch of high school kids involved through a certain program, gave them SenseMaker and got them out there interviewing people in their villages. And there's nothing as motivated as a ticked off teenager. And so these kids went out and they got millions and millions of stories. And that human sensor network that they created by making it about high school kids with their smartphone in their hands was really powerful for them in terms of being able to pick up those weak signals. So you'd have to look at your context and say, who's out there in the world? Maybe in businesses, it's often your staff and your customers and your close partners are your human sensor network. And then what do we want to ask them to comment on? Okay, so we're getting a little deeper than I think session 2 is fully teed you up for. One of the things we're going to highlight tonight is that a couple of extra resources have been released in your e-learning. And it does go into a little bit more about some of these movements, some of these transition points, the vector theory of change, all that good kind of stuff. So our focus next week is, great, if this is the way it is, how do we manage within that? How do we strategize? How do we plan? How do we set goals? How do we move forward? So it's not just a case of, well, you're not going to have an answer. We're never going to converge. We're never going to go forward. We're definitely not that school of complex facilitation and intervention. Any other questions coming up? Dan Feldman, I think you had